Now, today is one of those days where I feel compelled to shoot some video, but I'm not sure exactly what to talk about. So discovering what it is that we're going to talk about is going to be part of the video format. Well, here's something. I read an article today about TikTok, stating that, and TikTok, by the way, is it's an app that is kind of like an even more ADHD version of YouTube. That's maybe how I'd describe it. But kind of with aspects of other apps in there as well. I've only played with it a little bit. But in any case, I'm very interested in TikTok as a new video ecology, you know? I keep wondering if there isn't some way to bring Sync Century over to it. I wonder about the possibility of kind of super compressing, say, a 9/11 sync or some other sort of popularly
So you think you can just explode on all my mushrooms?
grounded sync. Like sometimes I think about, for instance, the weird stuff surrounding Susan Sarandon related to this somehow? I don't think so. But the sync surrounding Heather O'Rourke's death, the child actor who played Carol Ann in Poltergeist. I think it's the year and the location, but many aspects of her death are predicted by the film. And in just the kind of syncy, backgroundy sort of way that makes my body tingle, you know. That one in particular, because it's so dark and sad, it involves the death of this actor who I think was actually quite a great child actor. I mean, not a lot was required of her in those roles dramatically, you know. But she went above what was required just through her innate presence, which is a very rare thing in an actor. I think somehow maybe a little less rare in children, actually, because they haven't developed so much of a persona yet. You see these little flashes of divinity in them still, undisguised, you know? But anyway, Heather had a lot of that, I think. She died right after the production of Poltergeist 3, and she was already quite ill during the production of that film, which makes it quite a difficult watch, that film, in many ways. But the sync material, I don't know, a huge digression of all the Poltergeist movies now. At some point, we've got to look at them. They're quite important. And I'm sorry to kind of analyze it so cynically or something. Something connected to a tragedy has more viral potential than something that isn't. So I think maybe we could take something like that, compress it way, 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 way down into something hyper condensed that could fit in TikTok somehow. We have a big basic problem in the sync community, I would say. There's just not enough attention on the thing. It really just boils down to that. And I say that, I think, at least as selflessly as I can, as someone who's very involved with it, who's also an egomaniac, so maybe it's not very much, but as selflessly as I can say it, and the way that I get there is by focusing on everyone else's work. I just think about, like, as a fan of David's work, as a fan of Joe's work, as a fan of Alan Green's work. By the way, if you haven't watched his most recent Sync 2020 video, you must watch it. It's extremely brilliant. But so there's a great example. That video is so brilliant and it's just not getting the attention that I think it ought to. And it's mostly a marketing problem. I think ultimately it's strange and a little bit uncomfortable to think about something spiritual in those terms.
Is made up of a set of repeating and interlocking elements.
And perhaps we don't even have to say necessarily spiritual, because maybe that's not even your take on synchronicity. I don't know. It doesn't have to be related to in a spiritual way necessarily. I think it's difficult for it not to open up some spiritual cracks, avenues of thinking eventually. However, there are many ways of interpreting what that's all about. That's all I'm saying. So, synchronicity, even if it isn't explicitly spiritual, I think still has to be regarded as something quite unknown. Because we don't have any kind of etiology. We don't have an underlying explanatory mechanism for what synchronicity is or how it works. We can just observe that the phenomena occurs. It's such a strange phenomenon that we don't even know where to locate it, sort of subjectively, objectively on that gradient, right? It seems to somehow kind of transcend that division, which is what makes it so fascinating and something that you can think about so endlessly. It points to and kind of highlights the arbitrariness of certain fundamental categories of thought and perception that seem to fall short in the face of whatever this phenomena is. And so what I'm saying is, even if it's not spiritual, it's something very heavy, though. It's something potentially dangerous, because we don't know what it is. It's not necessarily dangerous, but something potentially, this could be many things, but because it's a question mark, I think especially when you have a question, it's like this, when an ambiguous thing appears in an environment, you're going to look at it and you're going to say, what is that thing? And you're going to project some models onto it. You're not going to do that consciously. You're not going to think, I'm going to model this thing. It's some strange thing that's confronting you. So this is going to be fast and unconscious. You're going to look at it and try, on the basis of its physical appearance largely, you're going to try to relate it back to other things you understand. And that's going to immediately give it a kind of a shade or a color, and you're going to say it's some kind of weird animal. I don't know what it is yet, but maybe you can determine that it's basically some kind of a creature. But now you don't know what it is. Is it a friend? Is it a threat? You're going to have to start looking at other layers of context around the thing itself. For instance, you might start to notice how it's behaving. But as soon as you're looking at these other contexts to try to fill in extra detail in the model that you're forming of this novel element, one of the things you might do, in other words, one of the contexts that you might pay attention to, is the group context of maybe there are other people with you in this environment where this strange thing has appeared, and they're also all doing this, and they're all looking at it. So it's going to be very natural for you to look at these other human beings and look at their reactions and use their reactions to inform your reaction. So if you look around and everyone seems to be laughing, you're going to assume, okay, this is some strange, deformed household pet I don't know about or something. If everyone's looking terrified, you're going to probably adopt a position of terror yourself. It's going to change the kind of the set of models that you pick to bring to bear on the situation. Incidentally, in fact, really not incidentally, this relates to a bunch of stuff that Rene Girard talks about to do with mimetic desire. The same basic kind of triangular structure of subject, object, and model can be used to think about this kind of basic group context. Another way to think about it is as a kind of emergent, high-dimensional coincidence filter. Sort of. It doesn't maybe exactly work in that way, but you're definitely trying to infer some things about object presence and also the nature of that object by having a bunch of perceptual systems look at the thing and then try to form an aggregative read on it. And think about how that might work in a physical space, right? Because it's literally, people are going to be seeing different perspectives of the object. They're going to be viewing it from different sides. So the person back here might actually know something that you don't know looking at it from the front. So it's very much in your interest then to look at what other people in the group are thinking about the thing. Now let's see, what was the context in which I was talking about all of that? I think I was saying something about marketing and synchronicity, right? Precisely because it's this weird question mark, I think we really want other eyeballs on it. At least I do. I'm not satisfied with what I can myself understand about all this weirdness. And I'm not satisfied with what the sync community in isolation can understand about all this weirdness. We really need some help, I would say, to understand this thing now. If we could take something like the poltergeist thing, crunch it down, put it into a medium like TikTok where it could really maybe grow very, very, very rapidly, especially because TikTok it's a little more mature now, but it's still kind of a young platform, which means it's going to be easier to make a wave in there than it is on the giant sort of YouTube arena, where it's just very, very hard to get through the algorithmic thresholds that then make your stuff visible. Okay, so anyway, I say that too much as a seg, but it's just it's the way that with these synchronicity topics, it requires a bunch of so anyways, because you're constantly opening up these weird little circumambulatory sort of brackets all over the place. What I was trying to say was simply that I read an article stating that TikTok tunes their algorithms, or at some point was tuning their algorithms in such a way to prevent videos with ugly people or sort of poor in the economic sense, like poverty implying environs from being seen. So if you're ugly, poor, or disabled, and those videos were being basically repressed on TikTok. First of all, I think that's hilarious and horrifying and of course quite grotesque. But second of all, it really did make me think about the fact that basic things like having a good light source on your subject make for more compelling video content. Well, okay, that was some kind of little weird intro, sort of hello everybody thing. What's the actual topic going to be? I still don't know what I want to talk about. Let's see. There are so many things to talk about. I mean, we're in the middle of a global pandemic at the moment. That's notable. There are many sort of lightly sync-related things one could say about COVID-19. I do want to say just a quick thing about the nature of superstitious ideation, though. It is a fact that we are now in the middle of a fear contagion that is spreading just as quickly, if not more quickly, than the virus itself. I have been pretty good about my mandate not to panic buy during this period. However, when I went to buy groceries the other day, I went to buy some bread at the local grocery store here in Flatbush, and there was no bread. There was just almost no bread. If I had gotten there a little bit later, there would have been absolutely nothing. I got like the last couple bags of pita that existed, and this, wasn't what I came there to buy. I was going to get just a normal loaf of bread. And various other things, where I got one of the last cartons of almond milk. You're standing there in that environment, and you're looking at shelves that are empty. And you're looking at people running around. Everyone's in a bit of a not a panic outwardly, but with just an anxiety, Some people are obviously ill, and who knows what they're ill with. Some people might have a flu or a cold, but it doesn't matter. The group eyes are on them. So there are all these strange, sudden tensions in the group. You're looking at something that in some begins to resemble the kinds of things you see in zombie apocalypse films and so on. And yeah, you start to panic a little bit. You start to think, shit, I better buy more than I need, because tomorrow there could be nothing. And when I was there, one of the employees told me that they were having trouble getting supplies shipped in from the main warehouse too. The reason there are these supply chain issues is because people are doing all this panic buying. But it's a self-reinforcing loop, unfortunately, because there's just a certain threshold at which now you start seeing that there's no food in the store. You start to panic buy as well, and then what little is left immediately gets sucked down the drain at kind of an exponential rate. The next thing that happens is people look at that whole situation and they say, okay, now there's no food in these stores. I got mine, so I've got my little stockpile now. And then it's just very natural. People start to worry about the possibility of other people coming to take their food, fundamentally. And so what's happening right now in the United States is people are panic buying not only food, but they're also panic buying guns and ammunition. There's no reason for them to be buying guns and ammunition, except that I want to make sure I can defend myself and my loved ones and my food pile. It gets that primitive that quickly, just under the threat of these things. There isn't actually a food scarcity or anything like that. Now we are probably sailing into a very, very serious economic recession, maybe an economic collapse. We'll have to see how that goes. So actual scarcity, it's not like that's not on the table, but today, at the moment, there's no scarcity. There's plenty of food in the country. It's just that the supply chain needs time to adjust to the fact that everybody all at once pulled a bunch of food into their own little sequestered forts, and so there's just a time delay there now, and so while that curve catches up with the situation, there's room for people to panic, and the panic is self-reinforcing in a contagious, exponential way that is greatly assisted today by the amplifications of social media. Because people weren't just having this experience firsthand. People were taking pictures on their phones, uploading these images of empty shelves, etc. That's, that it really just made it worse, and is continuing to make it worse. So what does that have to do with sync? Well, it doesn't really so much directly, but it has to do with instinctual behavior and unconscious behavior, and fundamentally with irrational behavior that manifests when people are under duress. I think a very important thing we can take away from this pandemic, and that I hope we do take, there are many things, of course. One thing is going to be a serious reassessment, I hope, of the way that we relate to information. The transmission of information is as important as the transmission of the virus. because it determines how people, well, it doesn't determine, of course, but it interacts with it interacts with the situation to co-determine how people actually end up behaving, which counts for a lot in the early days of a situation like this. And I'm a person who was not really taking this thing seriously until quite recently. So that has to do with information flow and the kinds of meta messages that we attach to our messages. In other words, the context that we set around that information. What I hope we learn is that instinctual and irrational modes of human engagement are never very far away from activation. We really inhabit a fantasy world in civilization. Everyone in civilization has agreed to play by certain rules, and those rules are held together through the basic sort of social contract and basic notions about the common good and so on. We imagine that we hold to those contracts by virtue of our principles and our deep commitment to them. But in fact, we hold to them because we're able to hold to them, because we're not in conditions of profound resource scarcity or other terrible conditions like being in the middle of a plague or some other sort of situation, etc., war, etc. Those things can evaporate overnight. Now that's not happening in the United States, or really anywhere in the world around this pandemic. It's not a collapse of civilization sort of scenario. But that's just the point, in a way. It's nowhere near something like that. You know, this is a very bad disaster. It's probably the best way to put it. It's as if it's a natural disaster. I mean, it really is in a sense. It's no different, really, from a storm moving through that's going to kill a bunch of people. You know, I mean, of course, it's quite different from that. But I mean, for the sake of this comparison, you know, we're just dealing with some huge sort of transcendental scenario that's passing over the human race. It has the potential to bring us together, and it is uniting us in various ways by illustrating to us how much of a global interconnected situation we're in and so on, all this. But as soon as people get really scared, they start to behave in ways that are very instinctually motivated. And all it takes is them being scared of something. The actual thing doesn't even have to have arrived yet. And already it can start to produce serious effects at scale. Now there really is a bit of a food shortage, at least in my little area of Brooklyn. It's hard to find stuff now. And for myself, it's a bit of a pain in the ass. Like, I have a very restricted diet, and I don't have access now to certain things that I rely on to have like a good quality of life, you know. Now, these are very minor problems that it's not really going to affect me that much. And by the way, so far, I'm not sick as far as I can tell. I'm basically quarantining here for now. I don't know how long we'll all be able to do that, you know. Really, we ought to probably all quarantine for a month or more. I think for most people, the prospect of doing that past a week or two is going to be pretty hard. It's another thing we might learn. Something about isolation. It's very strange to me that suddenly the whole world is dealing with isolation, because it has been such a theme in my life over the last several years. And that really is related now to synchronicity. There are people who don't have significant others and who are not living with other people like I am, who are trying to responsibly self-quarantine. They're basically sitting in their apartments by themselves. After a few days of that even, things can start to get a little strange. And there's not really good advice out there to tell people, you know, here's what to do if you start noticing weird numbers on your clocks, you know? So I don't know, as it goes forward, I wonder about, like, I'm not imagining any kind of big to-do about that, but I think that just in a kind of a broad, more generalized way, like, we're looking at the emergence of a world, because also, you know, this kind of situation is going to become more frequent probably as the environment continues to degrade, and as the population density continues to increase. Pandemics of this sort are going to be more common. Social distancing will probably be a much heavier fact of life in the coming decades. And so society is going to have to figure out how to help people be alone. It's quite a sad thing to realize. I think I'm going to close for now the topic of coronavirus. I have these two halves to my lab right now. I better do it right. There we go. We'll make it a big hemisphere metaphor as well. Maybe it'll work, maybe it won't. No idea. This is my alchemical laboratory, and over here we're going to have this big idea about models and perception and human group dynamics, and this big sort of model of society and paradigm manufacture and distribution and how that all works. This thing is very much in line with the classic sociology stuff that Peter Berger wrote about. I discovered his book through a very strange series of synchronicities and visions, actually. This book then, this book can sit as a weird unifying point. So I'll put it there, and we'll get back to it maybe. So anyway, there's this whole side that proceeds from this basic phenomenological model augmented with some Darwinian ideas and so on. This is all the stuff we talked about in the paradigm and meta-paradigm video. Eventually, this thing is going to include a bunch of stuff about the levels of learning from Gregory Bateson, and it's going to have some stuff from Rene Girard and Peter Berger and Jung, of course. But so that's kind of the problem. Is there's this whole thing over here, and then there's this whole other half to do with synchronicity and the dead and the image matches. So first of all, I don't know if it's obvious, why is there a problem reconciling these two things? The problem is essentially that this story, in my opinion, once you look at this whole image match situation together, and it's not just that, of course, also once you experience enough clairvoyancy in your own life, you'll come to realize that this whole picture, which is very reliant on sort of notions about an animal in space-time interacting with other animals, and that whole thing is incomplete in some way, because somehow information from the future and from the dead world is interpenetrative with this whole scene. And here's the thing about it is you can try to kind of naturalize it by squashing this down and saying, this is just a bunch of weird picture thinky correspondence think. Like, irrational, pre-linguistic, superstitious style, instinctual, unconscious ideation that lives in my brain somewhere. And that's really what this all is. And then we can just contain it in this system, and we can keep this big picture intact without having to think that it's incomplete. But the problem is that we can't seem to localize it there. I mean, those of us who can't. Those of us who can. I guess that's really all that can be said about it. I think there are people who investigate the idea of synchronicity and end up concluding that the thing really isn't much more than a kind of like tricked out selection bias, like a kind of souped up selection bias or something in the end. As soon as you have an experience of precognition, let's say, that you take seriously, and if you begin to form a belief about the reality of precognition, then you will simply have a direct experience of another reality. And so I'm trying to reconcile those realities. The primary question becomes one of reconciling history and eternity, something like that. Linear time and circular time, or, There's just a very deep problem here, I'm afraid. Because so much of this Darwinian story is based on the idea of competition and selection in this kind of game-like situation in which we imagine there's a lot of unknown chaos going on, right? Mutations, etc., that are then being selected for in various ways that are themselves quite complex. Now, I say random. I have my doubts sometimes about the existence of actual randomness in the world. I think it may be more to the point that there's complexity thresholds beyond which things just appear random to us. And so, there's that whole can of worms. But if information can be obtained in the present about an event in the future, it would seem to obliterate the necessity for having any kind of a game like that, because it would mean that the future is to some degree predetermined, or it would seem to mean that. Kind of first pass think about it anyway. I'm going to use Alan Waller as an example. My friend and colleague Alan Waller, who has precognitive dreams quite regularly and had a precognitive dream a while back that he was going to be mugged, and the next day he was mugged. And he was out with a friend of his. He even told his friend that he had the dream and that, hey, my dreams usually come true, so we should be alert. And so they were alert. And it was a good thing they were alert because the dream came true. So that's a very direct, classic case of precognition. Alan knew. It wasn't like it happened and then he was like, oh, I had a precognitive dream. He had a dream that he felt was precognitive, and within a 24-hour window, it manifested. But see, the very fact of the loop reintroduces the informational loop of, here's Alan being mugged at time T2. Here's time like T1. Alan having this dream about it. He receives a dream that makes him more alert, which probably affected the outcome of this thing. Maybe if he hadn't had the dream, maybe Alan would have been seriously injured, or etc. In the end, he was okay. So it was adaptive. So it fits the basic Darwinian idea of like, this makes sense as like, one can imagine it, at least in principle, some kind of selective pressure that might have caused Earthlings to develop this kind of ability. We've introduced a backwards causality in that case, it's quite clear, because you can say, well, there's no causality, it's acausal. The connection between Alan's dream and the event that happened in history is just it's an acausal link. It's just the kind of they correspond in meaning, and that's it. Don't go any further. It's like, but yeah, except that Alan still probably modified his behavior on the basis of this dream, though, because part of what happened when Alan had this dream was that this dream was signaling to him, I am a precognitive dream. So that makes it very, very, very strange and funny. It's as if the future is determined, but not completely. But how can it be determined at all? And how can you know that? That's the whole other piece of it, obviously. One, there's just kind of a hypothetical, imagining. Maybe the world is such a way that things are actually completely determined, because everything just moves along this sort of completely clockwork, causal, bump, 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 sort of billiard ball sort of thing. I mean, we know that it isn't really like that, probably, due to the revelations of quantum mechanics. But, well, that's just it, isn't it? It's just the same problem in a different shape, I suppose, trying to reconcile the quantum domain with classical mechanics, Newtonian physics, and so on. Somehow, the two things have to end up being the same thing, or they need to be able to coexist somehow in a big meta model or something. But no one's been able to do that yet. I think maybe the best that I can do, really, to sort of zoom way back out on all this now, is going to be to make a big map of the one thing. This is going to be this big sort of anxious modeler model. And this can be built up in a very rational, logical, supported by science and especially information theory sort of way. This will be a nice thing, I hope, in the end. It's not really a new thing. Like I say, first of all, the basic notions exist in ancient mystical traditions. Really, I was so impressed by Berger. I don't want to forget about that, because I had a sort of a weird visionary story to tell about that. But I've been so impressed by what I've read of him so far. I finished Pyramids of Sacrifice, and now I'm reading, I can't remember the title, but it's the one about rediscovering the supernatural. They're both just fascinating. Fundamentally, this is going to be a big synthesis of a bunch of different things I've read and thought about with a little bit of original thinking. Basically, I'm trying to put all this stuff into a shape that fits most pleasantly and natively in my brain. Because I find it a little difficult always to sink into Bateson's frame to understand what he's saying. It takes some time. But then it takes me a while to enter Gerard land. His world is quite different. Sometimes it takes me a while to get into Jung and to get into, I want to build a native frame for myself where I don't have to constantly sort of move between foreign languages, as it were. But what I can do then is I can understand where there's a space, where there's a, and there will be probably multiple locations, where there are things that cannot be accounted for with this model. And so what I would like to do is build explicit tunnels from those spaces over to the other big model, which is basically the Jungian idea about the individuation process. And that's where all this synchronicity stuff and all this stuff lives. And these two things are very intimately related. They're maybe the same thing somehow. I don't know that anyone will ever be able to show exactly how, but I think we can at least build these bridges. And so what I mean by that, explicitly now. I want to remember to talk about this Pyramids of Sacrifice story. It's starting to converge on it here a little bit, I think, because it's kind of related to the stuff I'm about to talk about now. A big part of the sort of anxious modeler idea is that people are in a general state of avoidance when it comes to recognizing the nature of their models as models and the nature of themselves as complex modelers. They don't want to have a confrontation with phenomenological uncertainty. The most that most people will do is tell themselves a scary story about phenomenological uncertainty. I encounter this sometimes talking to people about this stuff. They think they know, but they don't really. They understand theoretically the relativization of perspective in a different way, and et cetera, et cetera. But it's different when I'm talking to my friends who themselves have actually lived through an experiential demonstration of that fact. Either, let's say, you could do it with a psychedelic experience. You could do it by going crazy, by becoming psychotic in some way, and then getting better. That would be kind of leaving a world and then returning. You could do it by having like a near-death experience. You could do it by leaving a belief system, especially if it's a belief system that had a whole world attached to it for you. People who leave very insular religious communities, for instance, and build a completely new identity and a new worldview. You're going to actually be in some kind of a living situation that you cannot make sense of, but that you in some way need to make sense of in order to survive. So when you're transitioning from one belief system to another belief system, let's take that example. Now, what even is a belief system? It's almost better to say model network. But it's a model network that behaves in very, very curious ways. And in particular, I have in mind here the way in which repression functions. Repression and projection. There are certain models that are used to establish coherency of response in various domains of life. It's hard to say exactly how these things are arranged, of course, and it's very bad to have sort of too much detail in a model. If we don't know, we ought to put a question mark and say we don't know. So I'm putting kind of a half question mark here and saying, is it a network? Is it a hierarchy? It's probably kind of both and neither of those things, and who knows. These are just some ways of getting into the idea. But it certainly seems to be the case that we have models of reality that are more and less fundamental. And those models of reality also include self-definitions. They include models of who we are and how we are in the world. Those models are very, very important because they determine so much of our behavior. The kinds of beliefs I have about the world, in other words, determine how I interact with that world. The beliefs I have about the world are formed in a number of ways. They're formed through my interactions with the world in emergent learning situations. And to understand that, we have to look at Bateson's levels of learning idea. Which we've talked about this stuff before on the channel. It's models about the basic contexts in which activity patterns manifest. At any given time, you're in an activity pattern. You're doing something, even if you're idle. That's another activity pattern that is an idle one. Just amounts to saying you're always embodied and something's always going on. maybe that's not true in some ultimate strange mystical sense. I don't know. But seems like an okay assumption to have. Here I am, something's occurring. So I'm in an activity pattern, but an activity pattern exists in a context always. Why am I sitting idle? Because I could be doing something else. Why this possibility and not some other one? The belief system, though, refers to kind of the sum total network of fundamentally important models. Now that's all a little bit wiggly. What's important and what's not important, what's fundamental and what's not, etc., etc. But even though we can't define it precisely, I think we can still define it as a gestalt and just say that a belief system is a big collection of models that define our basic understanding of the world and of ourselves. And I had said before that I think a complete paradigm basically delivers three categories of models. We have models that relate noids, that's my weird little pet name for human beings, relates noids to themselves. Then they need models that relate the noids to the external world. And then they need models that relate the noids to other noids and to the group. Those are the three kind of areas of life that people really need. It always forms like these weird emergent faces. That human beings need to feel like they have a coherent map of their existence, basically. And so belief systems tend to have those three things. That's why there's such an emphasis on community in most religions. That's why most religions have things like prayer and other kinds of introspective practices. That's why most religions have a whole bunch of statements about the nature of reality and how things are the way they are and how you ought to behave, not just in the group, but generally in the world, and et cetera, et cetera. So there's all the predictable things you find in a complete sort of paradigm. Other sorts of like exclusively political paradigms might say, you don't need any of this. Don't worry about introspection. That's not, just make sure that you're conforming to the group political ideology and behaving according to the stipulations that exist therein, and make sure that you're doing the things we tell you to do in the world. A lot of political paradigms seem to function that way. I like that this has also now drawn an image of someone basically with their mouth like gagged, which is a condition you might associate with being preyed upon by a parasitic paradigm like a political ideology. And I think really they're all pretty bad political ideologies. I mean, I'm not a big fan. I think we need political action and political thinking in the world. Don't get me wrong. But I think that politics as a belief system is a pretty shallow belief system. I don't know. It's just my feeling about it. It's not going to help you with critical areas of life, fortunately. Which means you're just going to fall back onto unconscious attitudes about it all, because we'll all be quite repressed for you. And then it's repressed and it's not being managed very effectively. So anyway, what was all that in the context of? Shit, what was it? I'm going to have to go back to discover my train of thought. I don't take advantage of this enough. It's difficult with these long form videos where I'm talking for like an hour or two or three, sometimes to keep the thematic trajectories coherent. And so just breaking them up into smaller videos so that I can then look at my lecture history in real time as I talk. This will allow me to get oriented better. I wish that was kind of just incidentally kind of like I wish that was built into the screen record technology somehow. I wish that as my screen was recording, I could view a little sort of piling up stream of the recording off on this side, so that I didn't have to kind of interrupt the thing to view it. So that if I wanted to sort of scrub back to a previous moment, I could just kind of expand this thing. Maybe it has like an exponential curve on it, so that over here, this is like the last like 30 seconds of speaking, and then over here we have the previous hour of speaking. So as I tunnel into it over here, maybe it can kind of expand in a nice way, and with some nice motion, some nice inertial scrolling on it. And then if I find an area I want, it's just sort of like pop up here. I should be able to review it. I should be able to like cut a clip out of it, like pin it. I just don't know sometimes. Like, it's just really obvious that these tools were designed for spreadsheets primarily. They don't work in a creative, good way. All the basic things you want to do with them are just not really possible still for some reason. I was talking about, okay, we want to get to pyramids of sacrifice eventually. That's important. I was talking about belief system transition. First of all, there's just a big cost to changing any of these fundamental models, because so many other models rely on them to achieve their stability. There are certain things that you believe that if you were to discover that you were incorrect in that belief, would change virtually everything about your life overnight. One of the very basic examples I always give is the belief in your health. It could be that I'm going to die from COVID-19. It's very, very unlikely. I'm 35, basically healthy, and I've been through a lot of health crises in my life and survived them. So I'm not personally all that worried about it for my own bodily well-being. I'm much more worried about my parents and my grandpa. But this is a new virus, and it is therefore unpredictable, and it has caused death in people my age and even younger, who didn't have initial complicating situations. Seems that in some people it just kind of ends up triggering organ failure and other terrible things. So there's some small chance I may have already contracted it, and I could be dead in 2 days. And if I knew that now, I would not be sitting here making this stupid YouTube video. I would be behaving in a very different way if I actually believed that I was going to be dead in 2 days. Of course, I don't. Maybe it's not even that. Maybe I have cancer and I don't know it. If I were to discover that, every other thing about my life, whole giant areas of my life that I've spent a lot of time through modeling, planning, in other words, would become completely irrelevant. Because of that, people are understandably very, very, it's just innate, it's built in. It's not just some people. All people are very reluctant to change those fundamental models. And it can be even more fundamental than that. Learning that you're very ill might trigger a deeper model collapse that might hit the level of the total belief system. It's not so uncommon that people who are Christians, that something very, very bad happens to them, and then they leave the faith. So they think, well, if God is real, why would he let this terrible thing happen? Or variations on that, etc. There's another reason why you don't want to be in a situation where you are transitioning to another belief system, or just even worse, kind of without a belief system. Because that's the whole point, is there's going to be some like liminal zone before you find a new one. And during that period, you are going to be very, very vulnerable, because you're not going to be able to interpret reality or yourself or your relation to all those things that the belief system was providing, those models of you, these models of the world, these models of other people and your place in the community, and all these things are now thrown into disarray. And that's a real survival problem actually. And because it's a real survival problem, it's handled by some kind of deep systems in your brain. And if you're in that situation for too long, it creates it creates something that I call a paravoid. And in paravoid, you start projection. Very intense thing of the sort that the alchemists were. It's interesting. The alchemists were doing. That's one of those bridges. It's the first of all, it's the kind of thing that you can't talk about and expect to understand thereby. You have to. I don't think I need this up anymore. Really. You have to experience paravoid in order to have the experience of projection, of this particular kind of projection guided by the transcendent function. Man, that is just a thing that you can go through. And if you haven't, you just haven't. It's terrible. Like, I wish it wasn't that way. I don't think anyone who hasn't had an experience wants to hear that there's some kind of gated thing that you can't access with language and that you can't talk about, and etc. But there really is such a thing, I'm afraid to say. It's a matter of the right conditions manifesting. And this stuff comes flowing right back out like blood out of a toilet. To pick the canonical Zizekian example. It's the experience of being alone in the desert for 40 days. That's the, it doesn't have to literally be that, but that's the image that describes the situation. You've left your culture. Leaving the culture means leaving the shared belief system. And in antiquity, that would have meant, and still often does mean, physically leaving the society, like going into nature and isolating in it. It's hard to experience a paravoid when there's still kind of ambient reinforcement of the culturally shared, reality. It can happen, happens every day. But in this particular situation, I can be a little precise even about the way that the mechanism works. I actually don't think that a true paravoid is achieved in a normal belief system transition. People tend to pass through it very, very briefly and largely unconsciously. There's just a kind of frightening period, but they don't really experience it as a sustained state. Because very often, people don't leave a belief system until they have another one lined up already. They've already been doing some reading, as it were. They're already eyeing the other belief system, whatever it is, whether it's just atheism or someone's a Jew and they're going to become a Christian, or vice versa, or just et cetera, whatever it is. Someone's getting ready to become a metalhead, whatever it is, they've got something already lined up, and so they're not going to exist so much in a state of proper paravoid. The paravoid is just going to be kind of threatened or glimpsed briefly. A real paravoid might happen if it was more like you're in a belief system and you have a deep crisis of faith for some reason that just renders the whole thing untenable to you very suddenly and very abruptly. And now you're really kind of in the woods because there isn't anything else that looks like it makes sense, but you just know that this doesn't make sense. And now the world is an indecipherable and very threatening, therefore, terrain. It's quite natural that you're going to start sifting through what now becomes a dense field of question marks that defines your experience. In truth, this is always the case. There's deep ambiguity in our experience. We cut that ambiguity down to size by applying higher order contexts through our model network. That's the point of it. It's to cut down on the complexity, to achieve a pretend certainty. And that whole process then ends up producing projection so that we don't see the big ambiguous thing. We see a coherent world that makes sense to us by way of reference to these fundamental models, right? I don't see some big amorphous weird thing in front of me. I see a laptop, and I think I know what that is. And, well, do I really? Would be a good question to ask, in fact, because this laptop is something, in fact, quite incomprehensible. For one thing, it's connected to the internet with this giant complex system. More complex, or let's say competitively complex, with the ecosystem itself. So is my little model of what a laptop is even accurate when it's connected to this giant, big living? I mean, it can't be. I'm not accounting for any of the sort of actual complexity that sits, as it were, behind this object. I don't see that complexity. I see a little toy. And that's happening at multiple levels. The basic visual thing I see is a toy, something rendered by my brain in connection with a bunch of light particles bouncing around surfaces, and then a bunch of strange visualization that it does on the basis of that, which is profoundly constructive and generative in nature. So that's a toy already. But that's a toy that has a tremendous amount of ambiguity in it, because I don't know what's important and what isn't on this thing. I don't know what any of it means. In order to know what, or how to do anything with it, or to know any of those things, I have to have learned about it already. And then I have a model of what a laptop is, and I see this picture in my sort of picture experience. My embodied right hemispheric portrait of the world shows me an image of this thing. And then I left hemispherically graphed some abstract models onto it to explain to me what it is. In fact, all this happening unconsciously, of course. My model of this thing is what I see. I can't see it as some other thing, even if it were to be, unless I somehow update my model of it, which would only happen if this thing were to violate my modeled preconceptions of it in some way. That gets to, by the way, that's exactly what Heidegger is talking about with the tool analysis. The distinction between presence at hand and ready to hand. It's about if you're hammering, you're not aware of the hammer as hammer. You kind of see through it to the activity pattern. You're building a house. That's what you're doing. The hammer it recedes into unconsciousness. You only see it as a stark conscious object. In other words, you only see it as something with its own inherent complexity. If it breaks, or if it doesn't behave the way you expect, then your attention is on it, and you're like, what's going on with this hammer? You're sort of not aware of the hammer until it malfunctions, right? Very, very simple, kind of exactly the same thing here. You're not aware of your model. You're not aware of the model as a model until it's inadequate, until it fractures, until it's failed in some way. But because the models that are projected and are therefore constitutive, is that a word? Are constitutive of our reality. It amounts to a break in reality, what might be called a chasm in the real, which is the thing that I titled my book way back when I was trying to write a book. Way back in Seattle, which relates now to this to the Pyramids of Sacrifice vision story. So now it really has come around full circle. But just finally now, before we get to this thing about Pyramids of Sacrifice and all of this, which I guess I'll include in it, my little story about chasms in the real as well. It's all related. But because a breakdown of a projected model amounts to an experience of a breakdown in reality itself, it produces a lot of anxiety. And people really want to avoid that anxiety. So the more projected the model is, the less it's going to be modifiable, because the less it will be approachable as a model, Therefore, if it's going to be modified, it's going to happen through level 2 learning, which is a very slow process. So that gets to the Gregory Bateson levels of learning thing. If you don't know, you can read Steps to an Ecology of Mind for free. There are PDFs of it floating around on the internet. At the moment, anyway. So you could unconsciously learn some new level 2 models by very slowly interacting with reality. There's a bit of kind of like the frog in boiling water idea here. If it's a slow, natural learning process, the models can maybe update themselves a little bit naturally. But if something happens that's a big, violent break, then you experience the breakdown of the model as a model. Funnily, like even as you're experiencing it as a breakdown in reality. I mean, it actually reveals to you the fact that it's the same thing. It just shows you precisely what I thought was real was actually an incorrect assumption. It ends up highlighting the fragility of perception itself in the end. And so, when you're in this kind of paravoided state, in other words, when a chasm in the real has opened, and there's a bunch of uncertainty in there, like a big noise cloud in there, if it's the kind of situation where you're in a suspended situation like that, that's when the transcendent function might trip, which is basically a kind of projection and dream and art and vision guided model repopulation program. It's going to rebuild a bunch of fundamental models for you on the basis of archetypal templates. I'm finally now going to get to this business about pyramids of sacrifice. So, this is an image that I made for a book that I was working on called Chasms in the Real. I was working on this book. This book had in it the idea of a holy book for an internet religion. That was a notion in the fiction that I was working into this book. This book, Chasms in the Real, was going to be a weird blend of like narrative fiction and kind of philosophy and other stuff. I don't know, musicology and some other things. And one of the themes, one of the ideas in it was this notion of a new internet religion that had a particular book, of course, because religions have to have books. This is, symbolic of the paradigm. But this was going to be a religion that was going to spread primarily through the distribution of images on the internet. Now, this was just a notion in this book I was working on. And then I made this cover image for it very prematurely because I just like to make graphics and it helps me frame the vibe and the idea of the project. And, I made it fucking around in Photoshop. And then a friend of mine sent me an article during the 2016 election cycle when America was first getting its kind of exposure to the alt-right, and when Pepe was kind of in the middle of undergoing his transition from a relatively benign meme to a meme with a lot of negative context associated with it. Well, it really is all quite strange in hindsight because this Pepe cult of Kek religion, which was like a 4chan joke primarily, had aspects of synchronistic content in it because there's all this stuff about like rep digits and the post numbers on 4chan and all this stuff. I think there was a lot of explicit connection being drawn to chaos magic and things like that. So the point was that for some bizarre period of time, the Kekists were claiming this book as their kind of big religious book because it's called Mimetic Magic, i.e. meme magic, and because it has a frog on it, and because it was written in 2004, way before Pepe memes, and so that was taken as kind of evidence of its divine status. You know, again within the context of this weird 4chan joke. But the thing with these weird internet jokes is that they often become real in unanticipated ways. And in general, the world seems to be in a mood for things like that. How to make sense of Trump without considering it on some level a kind of a joke that became not a joke. I think there's something about that flip right now. This article that my friend sent me, it was all about this weird, jokey internet religion that nevertheless had kind of funny, like, rep digit related synchronicity ideas attached to it. Although that wasn't really so much exactly a thing on my mind at the time, but although I did raise an eyebrow at that stuff. Then it's like a meme religion that then had a holy book, which is just what I was writing. It was like the plot that I was writing about in my book had spilled into reality in this funny way. And then when I looked at the cover of the book, I was so struck by the correspondence between it and the image I had made. This will be fun. Let's do a little markup of it right now. Let's start with the large-scale structural properties. First of all, I want to note that both images involve a frame within a frame. Now, that's not exactly the most novel idea for a book cover. Many book covers involve frames within frames. However, not all book covers involve it, so it counts as a point of correspondence. Furthermore, they both fill the outer frame with very similar material, and that correspondence is actually pretty dimensional, because we get not only a similar color, this is purple and mine's a little more on the blue side, but not really outside of the realm of something we could call purple. Those are quite similar colors, I would say. They both have the same general texture. It's kind of like wave or cloud patterns. And in my image, the cloud kind of also exists here in the form of this big green gas thing. So on mine, the texture is a little split or something. It's almost as if you combine the idea of the cloud and the idea of this wavy sort of repeated texture, you get this. But anyway, even not considering the gas cloud, I think just looking at the texture we get on the purple area, that's a pretty close match. Overall, we have an image consisting here of purple, green, white in this area, and yellow, and also white on the text. And in my image, we have an almost identical color scheme. We have purple, green, yellow, white here in the form of the text. And also, I want to note that both images have a little bit of red. There's this red element here, and there's the red subtitle on my image, Cyberdelic Horror Novel. We already kind of noted it, but let's just state again, both images involve white text. And again, this is something that's quite common, but it's not universal. You often see the author's name at the top. Here we have it at the bottom, and that's true in my image as well. So both book covers have opted to have this basic scheme. A title at the top, some kind of a subtitle in the middle, and an author name at the bottom. Furthermore, I think there's some similarity in the word choice. Chasms in the real, and then Mimetic Magic tells us that it's going to be about the fabric of reality, manipulation of the root social matrix in the fabric of reality. These are kind of eerily similar as well. I would say the next major element of kind of image correspondence is the placement of a yellow triangle close to the center of the interior frame. I think that for me is really where my brain started to break apart back in 2016. I was like, well, hold on a second. That's too much now. Now there's too much. Now, there are differences, of course. This has all this white here. Don't have anything like that in my image. This whole thing with the frog and all the whole kind of meat of the painting is absent here. It was this plus the fact that this book was situated in a real world context that resembled the story I had baked into this thing. Well, so this was really my first encounter with an image match. So my first encounter with this kind of thing was not in the context of 9/11 Sync or any of that business. It was just a very weird personal thing. I had made this image and in the end felt as if I had actually remote viewed this book and some information about this book. This actually seemed to be what happened. Well, and then the story just got even nuttier because of the content of this book. It turns out what this book is mainly it's a set of instructions on how to perform automatic drawing, which is what this thing in the middle is. It's an automatic drawing that Kirk Packwood made. I eventually established contact with Kirk, and we had some very, very interesting conversations. He seems like a really great guy. After reading this book, I began to create my first automatic drawings, which today has grown into what I consider, anyway, to be a rich art practice. But at the time, this was such a strange trip I was on. I mean, it was radically experimental from my standpoint. Like, I had remote viewed this weird book that now was telling me that I could use automatic drawing, use a process that would channel unconscious control into a writing utensil to produce images that could be used to magical effect, or that themselves were magical in some way, because this book was arguing for various sort of divinatory things that could be done with this system as well. And wow, when I started doing it, there was just such a huge eruption of content. And then I was really deep in it because synchronicities started flying around, and this was some kind of scheme of the unconscious. You see, it led me to this book so that I could be taught, fundamentally, so that I could learn how to zone out in this particular way. That then allowed my unconscious to establish a direct link. Now it didn't need to direct me to external material exactly, although it did in fact continue to do that because it was going to lead me to the 9/11 content eventually as well. Via this John Carpenter
Twin Pines Mall, we will bear witness
collision.
to a sudden surprise terrorist attack perpetrated by
I kind of drawn a little
Muslim
halo around my head.
terrorists.
It's funny. But it established this direct... well, in fact, at this stage, I guess we still can't really even call it direct, because it was still me drawing a bunch of pictures in this automatic way, and then I'd look at the pictures and try to interpret the strange symbols that appeared in them and other things. A lot of them were told little stories and showed whole sort of ecologies of weird creatures, and some of these drawings were quite elaborate and all built out of deeply archetypal, mythic kinds of material. That's when I started to get into the Jungian stuff in a deeper way as well. So I'm telling that story to set up the conditions for the other story. So, okay, where to begin with this story? This is one that really could easily morph into another 2-hour thing if I go down too many side avenues in it. So let's not do that. I want to keep it concise. Basically, I've been having some deeper realizations about the nature of societies to do with foundational violence primarily. And in particular, I'm trying to understand the role of ritual sacrifice in ancient societies and the ways in which ritual sacrifice continues in the West. Not directly, exactly, but sort of how the same kinds of dynamics are almost kind of like substitutions for ritual sacrifice are taking place. And also how the fundamental dynamics, though, that are involved in ritual sacrifice are just going on in all kinds of different ways. I guess that's really what I need to say. Obviously, all this stuff relates very strongly to ideas about magic. Obviously, it all relates very strongly to ideas about 9/11. The first thing I found, I'm trying to remember how it was that I came across Girard. I don't know. I suppose I must have been Googling for things to do with like Aztec sacrifices or something. I must have found his texts that way, some way. I'm not sure. And so, right in time with discovering that whole stuff, and this will kind of side to the question, this was right on the back of kind of fleshing out these ideas about phenomenological certainty a little more and so on. I also came into relationship with this movie Monster Squad, which I found, that one I do remember, I found because I was searching for images of the Fox Photo logo, which I do from time to time. I'm always interested to see if I can get another photograph of a Fox Photo booth or if that logo in the wild somewhere. And I found a clip from Monster Squad, because it turns out that Fox Photo plays a very prominent role in that film. But anyway, the whole movie seems to me to be speaking very directly to these issues to do with culture, paradigm, ritual sacrifice, and phenomenological uncertainty. The whole plot is kind of expressive of it in a way that just pushes all the usual buttons. You know, I don't know if it's conscious or not. It's fluent and beautiful enough to imagine that it's conscious, but it almost, parts of it, of course, almost couldn't be. But anyway, watching that movie, there's a moment in it that really seems to grab the same image structure that we get in Moonwalker. The whole business with Joe Pesci choking the child, that gets replicated in Monster Squad with Dracula and the little girl. The little girl who's going to be involved in a ritual to close a portal to purgatory. That would be the metaphor for the phenomenological uncertainty. The ritual is obviously going to be a ritual sacrifice, although they don't really code it that way in the movie, but it's clearly orbiting around that. It has to involve a virgin, etc., etc. And then it delivers those ideas to us ultimately in the form of a 9/11 image match, projection space match, that uses an identical scenario to the one that we just got through looking at in Moonwalker. And how did I even find this thing? You know, I found it by looking for the Fox Photo logo. You know, it's just so strange how this stuff can happen in time, like clustered up like that. I mean, in my experience of time, like I had just finished looking at this movie, and then I had just had all these thoughts about phenomenological uncertainty, and I was just looking around for my favorite Fox thing, and then I found this weird movie that somehow acted as like a nexus between those things. But so anyway, through the process of watching that movie and thinking more about all the stuff and reading more Girard and so on, I started to have these and also through experiences that I've been having, just living in New York, both in my professional life and also in my love life, like being on the dating market. All of these things were swirling around in my brain. sometimes in a kind of painful way, you know. And certain series of images began to emerge. In the end, I'm calling these the blood pyramid images. But but it came in stages. The idea of it as a pyramid didn't come until the very end. When it started, it was like blood moving through hierarchically arranged compartments or sort of tiers or terraces or things like that. One image at a certain point was like buckets. Blood pours into one bucket, and then the blood pours out of that bucket into another bucket, and so on. But always with a strong hierarchical organization. And it's not like this was some completely weird alien vision. Why is it happening? I knew what it was about already. It's obviously this is a way of some kind of emergent picture thinky kind of way of modeling the deferment. It's not quite the right word. I don't want to take Derrida's word anyway. But for now, let's just say offsetting of aggression, fundamentally of pain, through emergent social hierarchies in a society. It's a basic kind of idea. I get into a big fight with my wife, but because of the nature of the power dynamic in that situation, I can't directly scream at my wife. But later that evening, my son does something very minor. Because the power dynamic supports this type of interaction in that case, but not in the other one, I take all that aggression I was holding in that I ought to have directed at my wife, and I direct it at my son, and I yell and scream at my son instead. That's the basic blood flowing down through the series of compartments. It's or you know, take any similar situation. I can't punch my boss in the face, but I can kick my dog. You know, it's just kind of, you know, this is terrible. Like stuff to be thinking about every day. But I was explicitly trying to understand this movie and trying to use the movie in order to improve my understanding of social dynamics. And anyway, as this image continued to morph around and suggest itself in my head, it began to take on an increasingly numinous shape for me, and I couldn't quite figure out why. In other words, it seemed starting to become about something more than just a little picture support to this other stuff I was thinking about. And one day, it very clearly became a pyramid in my head. And I said aloud the phrase, "pyramids of sacrifice." And then I Googled that phrase, and then that led me to this book. It's called Pyramids of Sacrifice by Peter Berger. Political Ethics and Social Change. Now, I don't know much really about sociology as a discipline. I found a book that had this title, that had this image on it, which exactly shows the idea. Here's the sacrificial victim at the top of the pyramid, and the blood flows down. I read this book, and this book contains in it so many of the kinds of things I've been thinking about over the last several months. Not just about ritual sacrifice, but about models and social reality modeling and all this stuff. This is the guy, Berger, who coined the phrase social construction, I think. Or at the very least, he introduced that notion into sociology. I guess he was kind of influenced by, what is this guy's name? Alfred Schutz, yeah. But so, anyway, this guy, Berger's first big book, or a big book of his, that preceded Pyramids of Sacrifice is this thing called The Social Construction of Reality, a treatise in the sociology of knowledge. Doesn't that sound oddly similar to mimetic magic? Manipulation of the root social matrix in the fabric of reality. Here we have The Social Construction of Reality, a treatise in the sociology of knowledge. I was so impressed by it that I wanted to look around like other things that this guy has written. Here it is. Right, A Rumor of Angels. I've got to remember to finish reading it before my loan expires. A Rumor of Angels, Modern Society and the Rediscovery of the Supernatural. So this was a very strange thing to discover, and again to discover at the end of a kind of a vision sequence like that. In the end, I think I feel that I did this again, but this time I did it without drawing an external image. I didn't have to make this book cover in Photoshop. I just received a bunch of impressions and then a word phrase that then led me to it as one of the very first Google. I didn't spend any time. It was just like, it's like, oh, that's what it is. The Pyramid of Sacrifice or something. And I Googled it, and here is this book, and then it relates also to this other book about supernatural stuff, and contains in it just all these pieces that I need, that I happen to need right now in my attempt to work on all these big meta models. My unconscious directed me to another thing that I needed through a picture, through an image match. But this time, direct. I think that means that that more direct channels of intuition are being established. But you see, what the fuck is going on? How? And what is going on with this image match thing? Why is that how it works? Why not, this is very strange, it seems to me. Why not just kind of throw this book into my path in some other kind of way? If we're imagining that the unconscious is not something purely contained in an individual's head, but that it can arrange things like that. And maybe it can. I mean, I've had experiences in my life that seem as if that's what's going on as well, as if the unconscious has arranged events in just such a way and so on. But this particular approach and this particular phenomenon of being able to visualize a thing that you will see at a future point in time, because now I'm looking at this image. You see, in this case, there really is an argument for a truly a causal kind of synchrony. In fact, because I think the whole point of the way the Aztecs did this was to keep the here, let's draw a blood pyramid. The reason they did this, this was actually really not intentional, but I'm in fact wearing a pyramid today. This is just one of the few clean pieces of clothing I have at the moment. So let's catch it from there. The Aztecs endeavored to keep this thing squarely in front of them in the form of a symbol. My belief is that the blood pyramid is an unavoidable consequence of human nature, at least at this stage of human development. There's never been a society that hasn't had this thing. Our society is just another big blood pyramid, Don't get it twisted. It's maybe the biggest blood pyramid that's ever existed. It's just that unlike the Aztecs, it's a bit more invisible often. What I mean by this blood pyramid is just that there is an emergent social stratification that occurs, I think, really in any society, because it has to do with the way that models and complexity differentials work. Fucking A. How much of this can go on open at the moment? You just end up with a thing where you get basically like a threefold caste structure almost always. And this is a little bit artificial. There could be many more gradations here depending on how you cut it up. But fundamentally, here's what happens. Culture has to synchronize the model networks between individuals in order to create a piece. It does that through the erection of paradigms, which it then has to distribute and install in some way. That means that classically this has meant that the paradigms have to become quite frozen so that you can do something like print a Bible and distribute it all around the society. As soon as the model network is standardized and synchronized, for the sake of this argument, it doesn't matter if the game space that emerges from that model network, from that paradigm, let's say, is a meta game or not, or at what level of scale that is, by which I mean how pluralistic is the society and what it will kind of allow people to believe and do with their lives and so on. Even if it's quite pluralistic, there's still a fundamental paradigmatic frame that's still delimiting in some way the global social game space. And so as soon as that game space is locked, you get competition for the resources that are made resources by the nature of the game. And I don't mean to suggest that the games that societies end up synchronizing around are entirely arbitrary either, like they just make some stuff up. Like some of them are that way. But many of these games are ultimately very tightly synchronized around human instinctual behaviors. So there are certain games, in other words, we're more or less doomed to play given the nature of our biology. A lot of that tracks human sexual dynamics, which is why I've been thinking so much also about, one of the reasons I've been thinking so much about human sexuality in this context as well. As soon as you have that, though, now you have competition for these resources. In order to get those resources, you have to play the games effectively. And the definition of playing a game effectively is limiting your responses to responses that advance you in the game. So your actions in the world, which your society defines for you more or less, defines the whole world in a way, your actions in that world, if you want to get at these resources and thus achieve success in the way that society sets it up, can only be gotten to through a reduction of what Stafford Beer would have called your variety. The complexity that you can manifest becomes very narrow because you can only manifest in these in ways that exist in reference to the game. It doesn't mean you have to play by the established rules of that game. You can cheat the game or hack the game, but it's always still in a dependent relationship on the nature of that game because it defines what strategies are going to be effective and what aren't. And so you just end up with some subset of people, therefore, in any situation, in any society that can exist, that have achieved wild success. Those are the people who come to occupy this top position. Then there are people who are unambiguously failing to play any of the games available to them in society. And so they sink eventually into compartment C. I'm borrowing this. This is all basically derived from Stafford Beer's model of chronic societary triage. I find his model quite compelling. So anyway, these people end up in category C, where this is really truly people are suffering in C. And they're becoming increasingly isolated from the society and distant from the society. And then because you have these people that are failing so horribly and these people who are succeeding so wildly, you then just get B as kind of the emergent everything else in the middle. It's people who are playing these games to some degree, with some degree of success, enough to keep them invested in the global social fabric. And they're motivated in a dual way. They're motivated by fear of falling into category C, compartment C. Stafford calls them categories. I like compartment because it works with this blood pyramid notion better. So they're motivated by fear of falling into compartment C and a desire of climbing into compartment A. So this is incidentally why I think that Girard seems, and I'm just starting to read Girard, so maybe he does address this stuff elsewhere. But the things I've read so far, right now I'm in the middle of Violence and the Sacred. He focuses so much on mimetic desire. And first of all, I don't think that all desire is mimetic, although I think a whole lot of desire is mimetic. But there's also the matter of mimetic fear. And that relates more to this half of the blood pyramid. The truth, of course, is that for the vast majority of people in compartment B, they're not going to make it into A. The big social lie often is that if you work hard and do everything right according to the laws of the society, you'll eventually find your way into this level of opulence and wealth. For some people, that will happen. For the vast majority of people, that will not happen, and the system is not really built in such a way to encourage that, actually. People in A would quite like to keep compartment A exclusive and small. They don't really want it to grow, to let in the unwashed masses. It's just how it is. And so the whole thing as a whole exists to maintain social control, but it is quite unstable. It's unstable for a variety of reasons. I didn't want to get into a huge discussion about societary triage and all of this at the moment. But I just want to say a quick thing about models and complexity relationships, which is that the people who are in A become models for the rest of society. And in particular, people who start off in compartment C or compartment B and do manage to climb into A, they really become models. And I mean this almost in the commonplace way. They become like role models for the rest of society. So society wants to tell you, like, see, look, imitate these people, and you too can enter category A, knowing full well that you won't really be able to imitate these people. Because in fact, in many cases, it wasn't so much about behaviors that these people did. It was about being in the right place at the right time and a whole bunch of magic being operative, and also about a bunch of ineffable, innate gifts and talents, and also often a lot of power and privilege and money, frankly, that facilitates doing the kinds of things you need to do to eventually climb into even kind of the outer rungs, let's say, of compartment A. It's just the case that the people in the top compartment themselves become models for the rest of society, and also are the ones who often are involved in, or who are explicitly involved in, creating the rest of the models anyway that society uses. They set the policy and create the paradigm, or at the very least enforce and distribute the paradigm. The thing about the paradigm, about any paradigm, as we've said, is that it doesn't exhaust reality. The people who are in A have a lot of resources. By this, what happened, they played this game, whatever the game was, they played it effectively and maybe kind of early on or something, and now they get to hoard a bunch of resources. Fundamentally, I think often what it is these are the people who had no problem cheating in some way to get up into this compartment, violating various aspects of the social contract and so on. But in any case, they don't have to deal with the environmental complexity that people in categories B and C have to deal with, who are struggling to survive, especially the people in compartment C. These people are assaulted like all day long, every day, by complex problems that are engaging them fully, moment to moment, like where's my next meal coming from? Where am I sleeping? Etc., etc. Paradigm stuff, and especially like the surface level trappings of that stuff, like a bunch of like laws and sort of platitudes about how to be a good citizen and blah blah blah. Those things are not at all helpful to the people in C, because they're dealing with a level of like daily strife and suffering that this stuff just has no assistance for typically, or if it does, it does so in some very kind of unworkable way. It's like eventually people in compartment C would like to see some real change, some real justice, some real modification of their situation, and not just endless sorts like demands to conform to a thing that they can't conform to. That's why they're down in C. So the whole blood pyramid has a strange kind of gradient to do with how well models are mitigating environmental complexity, and also how much of the situation can be repressed. A huge part of what keeps people invested in compartment B is the fact that the paradigm can be believed in a little bit more naively than for the people who are trapped in C. The thing is that the A really relies on C existing to put the fear into B, also to keep them a bit complacent and so on. But okay, it's the case in that kind of pyramid, in this blood pyramid. So this is why it's a blood pyramid now. Let's shift to red. People who are at a similar position to me in the pyramid are the people similar or above. These are the people whose opinions matter to me. As a terrible evolved monkey, I don't really care about what people beneath me on the pyramid have to say about me. They're beneath me on the pyramid. What do they know about me anyway? But wow, if you're unequal to me, or especially if you're up there in the coveted compartment A somewhere, your opinion matters, because everyone else is going to look to you or look to those people for their opinions. It's like, let's take the extreme example. If a homeless person on the street calls me an idiot, it carries no social weight. But if, let's say, a famous intellectual in category A, let's say Elon Musk, I don't think he's exactly an intellectual, but he's like a brainy public figure, you know. If he were to call me an idiot, well, that carries a lot of weight. A lot of other people might be saying, well, yeah, Jordan must really be a fucking idiot because Elon Musk thinks so. He's our role model, you see. He might not even conceptualize it that way, of course. Might not think I'm modeling my opinion on Elon Musk's opinion. If they did think that, they might feel a little like weird about doing it, you know. But nevertheless, they're doing it, and it's quite natural to do it in a social hierarchy like this, as obnoxious as it is. But so because of that, because I care about what other people think of me, who exist at my level or above me, or let's say in practice maybe even a little bit below me, but there's kind of a range there, and those are the opinions that matter to me. And it's not just their opinions, it's like the relationships there matter. Because those relationships matter to me, because they're delicate and contingent, I am going to be often much more reserved in how I deal with those people. I might really, really kiss Elon Musk's ass so that he'll broadcast a good opinion about me, let's say. Or I might be very diplomatic in a dispute that I'm having with someone I consider to be an equal socially. I might give them a lot of benefit of the doubt and really endeavor to maintain fairness in the context of the dispute and so on. What that leaves, though, unfortunately, is a bunch of excess affect that gets shunted right into the unconscious, where it festers. I don't know what people think about the unconscious. They just think it's like an infinite black hole that you just shunt this stuff into forever. It doesn't work that way. It's going to attach itself to some other target. And who do you think it's going to attach itself to? There's going to be people beneath you in the blood pyramid, of course. So it's just exactly what I was talking about before. You kick the dog instead of punching your boss. A dog is very obviously beneath you in the blood pyramid. It's not even a human being. Who cares about the feelings of the dog, etc., etc. Of course, there are people who care. Most people with a conscience care, but they might do it anyway. That's the thing. People do abuse their pets. People do take things out on completely inappropriate targets routinely. It's not a fluke or an aberration in human behavior. It's the very texture of the social fabric itself. Big part of it, anyway, is blood pyramid. So anyway, it speaks to our fundamentally vampiric nature. Not that I think we're fundamentally vampires. It's just that we have many fundamental aspects that constitute us, and the vampiric is amongst them. It does no good to repress knowledge of that situation. It makes it worse. So in a sense, I think the Aztecs were a bit more sophisticated than us, because they instantiated an invisible but highly concrete aspect of civilization into a big external symbol, the pyramid itself, and then they performed rituals with that. Now, they performed ritual human sacrifice. Very interesting to think about why they might have done that. I think there are many reasons, some perhaps objectively magical. But I think that amongst these reasons must be something to do with paradigmatic programming. You perform a traumatic operation in the context of a ritual that is coding a series of models. So sacrificing someone on the pyramid is sacrificing someone to the social hierarchy as a whole. That's symbolically what's going on, but it's also ingraining the idea of the social hierarchy into your head as a picture charged with numinosity by way of the traumatic action. You might say that witnessing trauma creates a kind of momentary paravoid via the stimulation of a model collapse. The sort of the trauma wave of it like makes you very susceptible to level 2 learning. And so it would seem that this is a way of cramming some particular models into level 2 or emphasizing them if they're already there. And this is a little weird to speak that way. I think it's level 2 is more like it's the learning process that itself. So it would be more like the areas of the model network that cohabitate with models generated by level 2 learning. What I'm trying to say is, I think that this notion of the hierarchy as a pyramid, as a tiered sort of pyramidal structure like that, is itself simply an archetypal image. It's something that already lives in the unconscious. The Aztecs don't need to invent it and program it into their constituents. It's already there. This is just going to activate it. It's going to activate the sort of energy of symbolic hierarchy things. And it's going to attach it also to other cosmological models. Because these were also very calendar-synced sacrifices. And this also was not the only way that sacrifices were performed in the Aztec world. Some of them were performed in the context of games and other sorts of rituals and ceremonies that did actually model deep mythic cosmological structures. So I think altogether that stuff as a whole constitutes a big para-programming approach. So anyway, I was trying to explain how this was how this might be thought of as a real sort of acausal correspondence, because I was visualizing the blood pyramid because I was encountering things in my life and thinking about things that were activating this sort of archetypal strata of imagining. And so is Peter Berger, I assume, in thinking about these issues. And so were the Aztecs as a society, who also were using this image. in all cases, it probably emerged out of the unconscious. So we don't necessarily have to think in this case that my visions of the blood pyramid were a direct precognition of this book. It feels that way to me on the whole because this book ends up being so perfectly what I needed to read. But with the mimetic magic, Chasms in the Real sink. There's so much image structure that I take it seriously in a different way. And by the way, aren't I basically... It's not just that I have a pyramid, but the color scheme matches too. Okay, this feels like a natural resting point to me. I really am a bit sick of talking now. Which is good, because I felt a strong need to speak for a while. I feel satisfied. Yeah. I'm just going to cold end it. See you in the future. Bye.